As an avid fan of adventure and the unknown, I often found myself perusing Airbnb for unique and offbeat accommodations. This time, I had my sights set on a cozy cottage tucked away in a quiet corner of the countryside. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the stress of everyday life. Little did I know it would become the setting for a night of sheer terror. The listing painted a picture of a quaint, centuries-old cottage surrounded by a sprawling garden. The interior, as depicted in the photos, was charmingly rustic, with vintage furniture and an inviting fireplace. The host, a woman named Abigail, had received glowing reviews from previous guests who commended her for her warm hospitality and the enchanting atmosphere of the cottage. I booked a weekend stay and set off on the drive to the forgotten cottage, excited for the adventure that awaited. The journey led me through winding country roads, flanked by towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets to the passing wind. The sense of isolation was palpable, and excitement mingled with trepidation as I drew closer to my destination. Finally, I arrived at the cottage, and it was even more enchanting in person. The garden was a riot of colors, and the cottage itself exuded a timeless charm. Abigail, the host, greeted me with a warm smile and a basket of freshly baked bread. She provided a tour of the cottage, regaling me with tales of its history and the previous occupants. With a reassuring pat on the shoulder, she wished me a peaceful stay and departed. The cottage's interior was as cozy as the photos had suggested. I couldn't help but marvel at the vintage decor and the warm, inviting ambiance. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to start a fire in the fireplace and curl up with a good book. The crackling of the flames and the soothing sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside created a tranquil atmosphere. As night descended, I couldn't help but feel a growing unease. It was a subtle, nagging sensation, like a whisper at the edge of hearing. I attributed it to the unfamiliarity of my surroundings and tried to shake it off. With the fire still burning, I retired to my room, hoping that a good night's rest would dispel my anxiety, but sleep eluded me. The unsettling sensation persisted, and I found myself tossing and turning in my bed. As I lay there, I became aware of a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently rapping on a window pane. I strained my ears to listen, thinking it might be a tree branch brushing against the glass. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and my heart began to race. I threw the covers aside and got out of bed. Moonlight spilled into the room, revealing that the tapping was coming from one of the windows. With trembling hands, I approached the window and peered outside. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a figure standing in the garden. It was a shadowy silhouette, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. The figure's hand was pressed against the window, the source of the rhythmic tapping. Fear gripped me, and I recoiled, retreating from the window. Panic surged through my veins as I realized that I was alone in the cottage, with no one to turn to for help. I quickly locked the bedroom door and barricaded it with a heavy dresser, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Hours passed in agonizing silence, broken only by the persistent tapping on the window. It was as if the figure outside was trying to lure me out of the room. I dared not look outside again, for fear of what I might see. Just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, the tapping ceased. Exhausted and on edge, I cautiously left the safety of my barricaded room to investigate. The garden outside was empty, devoid of any trace of the mysterious figure. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, unsure of what to do. I reached out to Abigail, the host, to inquire if she knew of any strange occurrences in the area. Her response was unsettling. She claimed that there had been no such incidents and suggested that I might be imagining things. Doubt gnawed at me, but I couldn't deny the reality of what I had experienced. That night, I resolved to stay awake and keep watch. I positioned myself in a chair by the window, armed with a flashlight and a phone ready to dial 911 at a moment's notice. The hours passed slowly, and the cottage remained shrouded in silence. Just as I began to question my own sanity, the tapping returned. It started softly, then grew louder and more frantic. The figure was back, and this time, it seemed more determined than ever to gain entry. With trembling hands, I shone the flashlight toward the window. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. The figure outside was no longer content with tapping. It was now violently banging on the glass, its face contorted in a rictus of rage. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no denying it. Someone was trying to break into the cottage, and I was trapped inside. Panic set in as I realized that my only means of escape was through the front door, which was perilously close to the intruder. As the banging on the window grew louder, I made a split-second decision. I sprinted to the door, flung it open, and bolted out into the night. The cool air hit me like a shock, and I ran blindly through the garden, away from the cottage and the terrifying figure that pursued me. I stumbled through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps until I reached a nearby road. A passing motorist stopped to help me, and I frantically explained the nightmarish ordeal I had just endured. The police were called, and they conducted a thorough search of the forgotten cottage. To my horror, they found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of the mysterious figure, and no explanation for the relentless tapping and banging on the window. It was as if the events of that night had been erased, leaving only my harrowing memories. I left the forgotten cottage with a sense of dread that still haunts me to this day. I may never know the identity of the intruder or the true nature of the terror that unfolded within those walls. The cottage's secrets remain buried in the depths of the countryside, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. My fascination with eerie and mysterious places led me to book a weekend getaway at an Airbnb listing that promised solitude and seclusion. Nestled deep in the woods, the cabin seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. Little did I know that this adventure would turn into a nightmarish experience I would never forget. The cabin was situated at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by a thick forest that stretched for miles in all directions. The Airbnb listing had boasted about the cabin's remoteness, its cozy wood-burning fireplace, and a serene lake nearby. The host, a cheerful woman named Sarah, had garnered praise from previous guests who praised her for her hospitality and the tranquil ambiance of the cabin. I arrived at the isolated retreat with a sense of excitement. The drive had been a journey through dense woods, and the isolation was almost suffocating. As I approached the cabin, it stood in stark contrast to its surroundings, a cozy, rustic haven amid the wilderness. Sarah greeted me with a warm smile, her friendly demeanor putting me at ease. She gave me a tour of the cabin, explaining how everything worked and where I could find supplies for the fireplace. With a reassuring pat on the back, she wished me a peaceful stay and left me to my solitude. The first evening in the cabin was a serene one. I lit a fire in the wood-burning stove, curled up with a book, and savored the tranquility that surrounded me. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of nature, and I welcomed the chance to disconnect from the outside world. As night fell, I decided to venture out for a walk along the lake's edge, hoping to capture the beauty of the moonlight on the water. The path to the lake was narrow, winding through the dense woods. The silence was absolute, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I reached the lake, and its still waters reflected the moon's silvery glow. It was a breathtaking sight, and I couldn't resist the urge to snap some photos with my phone. As I was capturing the moment, I heard a faint rustling sound from the nearby woods. I turned my attention toward the source of the noise, but I saw nothing. I dismissed it as a nocturnal animal and continued to take photos. But the rustling grew louder and more persistent, as if something were approaching. Unease settled over me, and I decided to head back to the cabin. I quickened my pace, but the rustling in the woods seemed to follow, as if something were tracking me. Panic clawed at my chest as I fumbled with my phone's flashlight to illuminate my path. That's when I caught a glimpse of it, a shadowy figure darting between the trees. It was humanoid but moved with unnatural speed, always just out of my line of sight. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. With adrenaline pumping, I finally reached the cabin and bolted the door behind me. The sound of my own ragged breaths filled the room as I peered out the window, but the figure had vanished into the darkness. The night passed fitfully as I lay in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the shadowy figure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something sinister lurked in the woods. Sleep remained elusive, and I was acutely aware of every creak and rustle outside. As the first light of dawn broke, I mustered the courage to investigate. I ventured outside to the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was no trace of its presence. The forest was eerily still, and the sense of isolation weighed on me like a heavy shroud. I decided to reach out to Sarah, the host, to inquire if she knew of any strange occurrences in the area. Her response was unsettling. She claimed that the isolated retreat was known for its peaceful seclusion, and that I might have been imagining things. Doubt gnawed at me, but I couldn't deny the reality of what I had seen. That night, I decided to leave the cabin behind and return to the safety of civilization. As I drove away from the isolated retreat, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure watching me from the woods. The memory of that night still haunts me, a reminder that even in the most serene and isolated places, darkness can lurk just beyond the tree line. I had always been drawn to the idea of staying in a remote and secluded Airbnb. The promise of solitude and tranquility was irresistible, and it led me to book a weekend at the secluded villa, a listing that seemed to offer the perfect escape from the noise of the city. But what was supposed to be a peaceful getaway would soon turn into a nightmarish ordeal I would never forget. The villa was located on the outskirts of a quiet countryside town, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. The Airbnb listing had described it as an idyllic retreat, boasting modern amenities, breathtaking views, and complete privacy. The host, a friendly woman named Emma, had received glowing reviews from previous guests who praised her hospitality and the serene atmosphere of the villa. As I arrived at the secluded villa, the isolation was immediately apparent. The gravel driveway wound through the woods, leading me to the elegant house that stood at the edge of a pristine lake. The villa was a majestic sight, with large windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. Emma greeted me warmly at the door, her welcoming smile putting me at ease. She provided a tour of the villa, explaining how everything worked and offering recommendations for nearby activities. With a reassuring pat on the shoulder, she wished me a peaceful stay and left me to enjoy the solitude. The first evening at the villa was a serene one. I lit a fire in the modern fireplace, opened a bottle of wine, and watched the sunset over the tranquil lake. The isolation was a welcome escape from the stress of everyday life, and I relished the opportunity to unwind. As night descended, I decided to retire to my bedroom on the second floor. The villa's large windows framed the dark forest outside, and the moon cast an eerie glow on the landscape. The isolation was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of vulnerability. I had just settled into bed when I heard it, a faint but distinct noise from downstairs. It was the sound of a door creaking open, followed by hushed whispers. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was not alone in the villa. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and quietly dialed 911, keeping the call muted so as not to alert the intruder. I strained to listen to the whispers, trying to discern any words or clues about the intruder's intentions. The hushed conversation continued, growing louder and more agitated. It was clear that there were multiple intruders in the villa, and their voices were filled with urgency. I could hear them moving through the rooms, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. My heart pounded in my chest as I contemplated my options. I had to stay hidden and wait for the authorities to arrive. I silently locked the bedroom door and crouched in a corner, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I could hear the intruders getting closer, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Fear gnawed at me, and I struggled to control my breathing. Suddenly, the bedroom door handle jiggled and my heart leaped into my throat. The intruder on the other side was trying to gain entry. I held my breath, praying that they wouldn't break through. Moments passed in agonizing silence, and then I heard a muffled curse as the intruder moved away from the door. Relief washed over me, but I knew that my hiding place was precarious at best. The intruders continued their search of the villa, their footsteps drawing closer to my hiding spot. I couldn't see them, but I could hear their voices growing louder and more agitated. They were getting closer, and I knew that I was running out of time. Desperation took hold, and I decided to send a text message to 911, providing my location and pleading for help. I held my breath as I sent the message, hoping against hope that it would reach the authorities in time. Minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder and closer. The intruders must have heard them too, as their voices became frantic. I stayed hidden, clutching my phone and praying for a swift rescue. The sound of approaching sirens was deafening, and I could hear the intruders scrambling to escape. The authorities arrived at the villa, their shouts echoing through the house as they searched for the intruders. As the police apprehended the intruders, a wave of relief washed over me. I had survived a night of terror, thanks to the quick response of the authorities. Emma, the host, was equally horrified by the intrusion and had no knowledge of the intruder's intentions. The secluded villa had turned from a peaceful retreat into a nightmarish ordeal. The isolation that had once been so appealing had become a source of vulnerability, and the tranquility had been shattered by the presence of intruders. It was an Airbnb experience like no other, one that had tested my courage and left me with a lasting fear of the unseen dangers that lurk in the darkness.